First of all, my greetings and wishes to all of you. First, we're going to say the praise to Majishri. Making salutation to Buddha Shakyamuni, extract from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. Enthused by great compassion, you taught the concept of dependent origination in order to avoid the perverted views. Students who are gathered here, I'm just wondering as to how many of you didn't take part last year. Just raise your hands. Those who are not present last year, so there are quite a number of you. From how many different schools and colleges the students are from? They're from 25 students from America, Canada. So those from America, just raise your hands. Those from America, just raise your hands. Just raise your hands, those from America. So I saw one. Then those from Canada, just raise your hands. Raise your hands, those who are from Canada. So actually I need to use a pair of binoculars. And from Australia. Raise your hands, those who are from Australia. From Nepal. Raise your hands, those who are from Nepal. Now those who are born in Tibet and escaped to India, just raise your hands. Those who are born in Tibet, escaped to India. So since last year, the organizers, they requested me to meet with students for some teachings. And then the teaching that I gave last year, you also put them in the form of, brought that out in the form of booklet. So that is available. We are meeting again this time. My wishes and greetings to all of you. and also to the organizers. I'm really very thankful to the organizers and those concerned people. We are Tibetans. In terms of the landscape, the environment, ecological situation of Tibet, there is saying, worldwide saying, that Tibet is the roof of the world. Generally speaking, tradition, the habitual patterns of the people, they are determined by the environmental condition. In terms of the earlier Tibetans, style of living was much more in common with the Mongolians. They use horses and lead a life of nomadic style. Civilization of Tibet. If we explore into the civilization of Tibet, the civilization in terms of the farming, when explored in the Tibetan area, where once Greenland and now turned into desert, the west side of Tibet, and then gradually towards the east side of Tibet, Dome. And then also, I have a friend of mine. He told me that they found ancient artifact, which can be dated back to the Stone Age. According to their prediction, it happened to be as old as 30,000 years. So from that perspective, the Tibetan civilization, no doubt, is a very old civilization, on the basis of which we have the cultural heritage. In Tibet, in the early times, there used to be two parts, Tibet and Jiangsu, and then gradually the Tibetan religious kings, at the time of the Tibetan religious kings, the two were combined. So the Pumpo tradition holders, they consider the religious king Songtsen Gampo as something so cunning and ruthless, because their version of considering the religious king Songtsen Gampo as ruthless is because that Chogyam Songtsen Gampo, while the Tibetans have their own ancestral religion, abandoned that and invited a stranger religion from India, that is Buddhism. So whatever is the case, in the 8th century, a great Indian Buddhist master by the name Chandrarakshita and his student Kamalashila, they were invited to Tibet. And this Chandrarakshita, the master, he is respected for his eloquent knowledge in terms of philosophy, in terms of the middle way philosophy and epistemology. and it is by means of Shantarakshita, the religious king Tenzin and Guru Padmasambhava, that a new religion from India, Buddhism, was established. So from that perspective, the Shangshungs, or the ancient Tibetan religion followers, they are not to be blamed. So indeed, this is something to be researched more, because there are accounts from the Pimbo version. So we really need to do research as to by taking into account both the version from the Shangshung of the Pimpo sect, and from the Buddhist version, and also according to the artifacts found from Tibet, the ancient artifacts. So what is the case? Tibet is a land where religious, on the basis of the culture, on the basis of the environmental situation, particular environmental situation, they evolved a particular cultural heritage. In the earlier times, it seemed more like a nomadic pattern of living, where people go from one place to the other, and then while doing that, then leading a life of barbarian, stealing some others' belongings, like that, and then gradually becoming more and more established. In the form of settlements. So once someone also on the basis of that particular environmental situation, Tibetans, they have adopted a very particular traditional way of life. So once they were Tibetans in the West, and then they were having a job of sorting vegetables, and then in the vegetables you find worms. So these two Tibetans, they would take the worms out, and then making sure that these worms are well protected, not killed, and put in a very safe place. So the colleagues of these two, the Western colleagues, and they were quite amazed in the beginning, saw that as a kind of fun, and then gradually they also adopted that a sense of compassion. They also started picking up the worms and putting them in a more safe place. So again, this is one of the Tibetan tradition, Tibetan way of treating other beings, even the insects. They treat them so compassionately. Again, another account that I'd like to share with you is that once I met someone, a Tibetan, who happened to be part of the communist military force. So there was actually a Chinese, and then this Chinese, he noticed something, that the Tibetans, as soon as they see an insect on the way, they would make it a point to pick that insect from the road, and then put it on a side where it is a very safe place. So he was really very amazed, and then he started feeling a sense of fondness to the Tibetans for this typical compassionate attitude and nature of the Tibetan people. So this is a kind of compassionate attitude, natural attitude the Tibetans are with. So basically, generally speaking, the Tibetan community, no doubt, is a compassionate society. So once a Tibetan physician, traditional Tibetan physician by the name Dr. Wangil. So during the Cultural Revolution, the leaders of a monastery, along with the water fetchers, female water fetchers, so the leaders were being persecuted, and then the female water fetchers, they were asked to persecute these the monastery leaders. And then the female water fetcher, she stood up, supposed to persecute these leaders. And then she said that, oh, in the olden times, when I was the water fetcher of the monastery, so I used to get adequate amount of food, and on daily basis, on an annual basis, I get such and such such amount of gift from the monastery. So therefore, I have nothing to complain about. I have nothing to persecute these leaders. And then the Chinese leaders, they became so agitated, and they kicked off the lady from the meeting. Again, during another persecution period, during the Cultural Revolution, and then again the leader of the village was to be persecuted in front of all the villagers. And the villagers, they started bowing down to the leader and told him that, oh, this leader indeed was so kind to us, and there is no basis for us to persecute this kind leader of our society. So the reason why I am mentioning this is that basically the old Tibetan society was following a feudalism. However, so from that perspective, no doubt, it was a backward community, but still that was imbued. That was a society based on compassion. So again, another account, when Tatar Rinpoche was the regent of Tibet. That time I was very young. So the students here, you won't know what exactly was there in the Lhasa Patala. So then one old man was complaining that someone is not being impartial. So then I went to listen to the complaint. And that the person who was actually listening to the grievance of that old man, he was to be unbiased. But then instead of listening to what the old person had to say, the judge, he was simply imposing his opinions and stopping the other person to speak his mind. So at that time, the the subjects of the feudal system in Tibet, particularly those landlords, the subjects of the landlords, they were really very poor, and comparatively, those directly under the supervision of the Tibetan government, they were more well off. So of course, the old Tibet was backward, no doubt, but overall speaking, Tibet was a compassionate society, community. So then we became refugees. So then wherever the Tibetans are in exile, the other people, they won't respect. They don't respect the Tibetans for their education, standard of education, but they respect the Tibetans for their quality of honesty and truthfulness. So again, when I was younger, and immediately after coming into exile, I used to go to inspect the Tibetan communities here and there. So there was one bearded person, and I was happy to meet him. And then he told me that the Tibetan Sweden businessmen, they would go to the wholesalers, the Indian wholesalers, and they would simply take the sweaters on loan from these wholesalers without paying any money. And the Indian wholesalers, they really had a great trust and confidence in the Tibetans that they are being so honest and truthful that they are not going to deceive them. And again, once the group of Indians who were connected with the business, they came to see me, and they expressed to me that they really feel so close to the Tibetans for the wonderful qualities of honesty. And then again, someone related an account that someone gave a huge amount of dollars in the hand of a Tibetan to be forwarded to someone in another place. So that person told me that this is something so rare, rarely found in the West. At the most, you can send a kind of voucher in the form of letters or whatever, not hard cash. So again, we see that people, how much they give credit. They give credence to the Tibetan people for their honesty. And again, in Switzerland, the Tibetans who migrated to Switzerland, first they were involved in working in the various factories, just doing some trivial, petty works. And then gradually, the managers of the factories, they came to become so fond of the Tibetan workers there that they gained a great sense of confidence in the Tibetans, of the compassionate and the qualities of honesty. So this is something, a wonderful quality that the Tibetans have. However, gradually, over time, bad things about being dishonest, being cunning, these start to evolve in among the Tibetans as well. Once in Kulu, there was a clash between the Tibetans and the local Indians, and then because of which the few Tibetan shops were being burned, put to blaze. So the local Indians in Kulu, they were found reporting that the early times the Tibetans used to be so good, so honest, but nowadays they are degenerated in their qualities. So the reason why I'm saying this is that to be warm-heartedness, to be compassionate, is something inborn quality in the Tibetans, and a natural instinctual quality of honesty. So this is what we derived from Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, which is based on love and compassion, universal love and compassion, which became so widespread all over Tibet. And even during our prayers, we include that, for the benefit of all dear mother sentient beings, referring to all other sentient beings as one's mothers. Again, there was, when I was really very small, there were pilgrims from the Amdo area. So they would be the guys. They would put on the Tibetan robe, but inside and the upper part of the body bare, naked, with just the sheepskin cloth, and then these people, if you look at from the physical appearance, you might think that, look at how even they dress. They are of the animal skins. So how ruthless, how unkind these people would be. But they would come to me and say prayers that, for the benefit of all mother sentient beings, referring to all mother sentient beings as mothers. So this truly reflects the enormous, the good qualities of compassion. So in the earlier times, of course, there are some instances of bad actions. There's a decree passed where the people are not supposed to kill animals, where people are not allowed to run any form of poultry, bigotry, and so forth. There used to be, again in the earlier Tibet, there was at a place there where there was a lake, there would be the seabirds coming, and then they would lay their eggs, and the eggs they were in a very vulnerable state of getting destroyed. So because of the harms from external animals, other animals. So then the government assigned one person to give protection to these eggs, and this is his job, the person's job, and he is given the salary and these things for this job. So again we see, so I'm just wondering, perhaps this person could be eating these eggs, otherwise he's supposed to be he's supposed to be there to protect the eggs. So this is again the wonderful attitude of compassion, even from the government point of view. So, so this quality of compassion and kindness, not only that this is of benefit to the Tibetan community, but in the world at large, in the world as well, if we have such culture, it would be of great benefit. So, this world has 6 billion human beings, and this culture of compassion and kindness truly would be a source of factor for happiness on this earth. And nowadays we see that there are lots of people who feel so intimate and close towards the Tibetans. And the reason for that is they recognizing the culture and religion the Tibetans have, which are based on loving kindness. So whether it is from the point of view of one's individual benefit, interest of oneself, or the interest of the Tibetan nation, or the interest of the world at large, this culture based on loving kindness is truly very important. There are many people coming to see me, and there are many people whom I meet. I have nothing special to offer. I have nothing special, a quality, but what I talk to them is a discussion on compassion, loving kindness, and the concept of holistic attitude, concept of dependent origination. So it's not a matter of a religious issue. I speak about how to use the common sense of dependent origination. Although this dependent origination is what is taught by the Buddha, but this is pure outcome of the intelligence of human beings. So the more you reflect on this dependent origination, your thinking pattern will become more open. So in every field, this concept of dependent origination is truly very useful. And what I share with other people is to be compassionate and to take interest, to gain insight into dependent origination. And this is something relevant not only to the religious people, but also to the non-believers. And the reason why many people, they feel so happy, they feel so joyous to meet with Dalai Lama, they've become so fond of the Dalai Lama. It's not because that I'm a very special person, but simply because I teach these concepts of love, loving kindness, compassion, patience, based on the concept of dependent origination. It is for these reasons that many people start taking interest in me. So I used to tell the Indian people that I've nothing new to say. What I convey to other people, what I share with other people, is the rich tradition of India. I'm simply a messenger, and I have nothing new to offer. I simply pass on the message which is inherited from Indian Nalanda monastic university. So whenever I give talks, there were thousands and 10,000s of people gathering. They were coming there. They were attending my talks, not because that I have such wonderful qualities, but simply because what I say is something so rich, which is inherited from India. So the reason why I'm telling people at the Tibetans that we should be able to preserve the rich culture and tradition that we inherit is not because of my partial, my biased attitude towards the Tibetans, and not because of my narrowness in thinking, but because of constant reflection, investigation, and coming to the conclusion that this is of something benefit to every one of us. So, do you understand what I'm saying? Even in the Tibetan community, the Tibetans who are familiar with Buddhist teachings, when they encounter difficulties, they become more apt to tackle the situation difficulties more easily, and whereas those who are least acquainted with the Buddhist teachings, Buddhist teachings, they can easily get agitated when encountering with difficult situations, can easily get frustrated, and because of which anger can easily come about, and because of which it will give rise to violence. And whereas someone who is acquainted with this concept of dependent origination, a dependent origination of causality, dependent origination of imputation, so then the person can be more calm, can tackle difficulties more easily, and because of which frustration is less likely to come about. So therefore, the attitude, the mental attitude, the proper mental attitude is what would make a difference in the person's thinking. So gaining knowledge of the Buddhist teachings is something important. Even if you are someone who is not a believer of Buddhism, not a believer and not a practitioner of Buddhism, but the advice or the message given in this teaching of loving kindness, compassion, patience, on the one hand, and also the wisdom side, the wisdom which understands the dependent origination, interdependency of causality, of mental imputation, they will truly make a great difference in one's life. So there is no need for one to be a very religious, devout, religious person. Simply try to gain these qualities. So this is what I usually refer to as secular ethics. And the means to promote this as well is what I proposed to be done by means of secular method. So it would be helpful if you understand these concepts, even if you are not particularly a practitioner of Buddhism. During interfaith meetings, there used to be questions coming up, 3 questions coming about. First question is, what is the self? Number 2, has it a beginning? Number 3, has it an end? So these 3 questions are really very important questions. So I like to give the introduction of Buddhism to you on the basis of answering these 3 questions. So the first question, what is the self? What does it mean by self or a person? This world, from the primitive time, gradually gradually there was the sophistication of thinking happening, and because of which, at one point, people started asking questions as to what is this self? The animals, the, the animals, they equally share with human beings wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. But the animals, they don't have that capacity, that mental capacity to inquire about this profound question as to what this self is. So this is what happened in the human realm, and this question evolved about 3,000 years ago. During one of my visit abroad, I once met a scholar of Egyptian civilization, and he told me that religious concepts evolved in Egypt about 5,000 years ago. In India, it was 3,000 years. Now reflecting on the self or I, what is this self? What is this person? What is this I? Then one explores into it. Then through such exploration, one group of person through one's personal experience, when you say, oh, I'm seeing this flower, actually it is your eyes seeing the flower. But because of your eyes seeing the flower, you say, I'm seeing the flower. But there is innate feeling that, oh, I'm seeing the flower, although it is your eyes. Again, when you treat your body, you say, oh, this is my body. And when you treat your mind, when you refer to your mind, you say, this is my mind. So the self, in our natural thinking, the self appears as though it is what possesses the body and the mind, the possessor of the body and the mind, and the body and the mind as the objects to be possessed by the self. And in the earlier times, there used to be people who could recall their past lives. And then, upon recalling their past lives, so that self which existed in the previous lives, it is totally disconnected with the body of this life, the present mind. And yet, there's a self which transmigrates from the previous lives to the present life. So, from which this group of the people, they infer or they concluded the existence of a self which is distinct from the body and the mind. And this is what is believed by many of the Indian religious traditions. So again, reflecting, first you say, oh, I was present in the last life, and this life will go in the next life. So there's a self, but in terms of the body and the mind, it changes all the time. And then again, when you say, when I was young, when I'm a little bit older, and then when I will be old, without white hair and with white hair. So in all these cases, in all these cases, the, we do see changes in the physical body, but there's a self which remains unchanging, the self which is the possessor, which appropriates these and the body and the mind. So, on the basis of this thinking, a group of people they concluded that a self or the person is something distinct from the body and the mind. This is what is believed by many of the ancient Indian religious beliefs, and also Christianity and Zoroastrian. All these traditions they talk of the presence of a soul. From the perspective of Christianity, they don't accept their former lives, and the way, the manner in which they accept the continuation of this life is not exactly the way they accept and the way it is accepted by the other traditions in terms of the rebirth. But they do accept a concept of a soul after the death. They believe the resting state, where the soul, the soul is in the coffin. So I'm just wondering if the soul is in the coffin or outside. I don't know. I'm not expert on this. So whatever is the case, they do accept that the soul is in a resting state, and then at one point there's going to be the judgment made. And if, according to the judgment made, if the person has accumulated virtuous deeds in relation to God, they will be led to the heaven. And whereas if they did something bad against God, they will be sent to hell. But the Buddhists, we don't believe in the concept of creator or God. In the 1960s, once there was an American lady who was so gentle and kind, and during my visit to Kulu, that lady told me that she was once there in Kulu for a visit, and then she told me that the Tibetans, she narrated that the Tibetans there, they are so gentle and kind, but unfortunately they don't have any religion. So by religion, she was referring to Christianity. So from the perspective of Christianity, Buddhists, since they are non-believers of God, so after death, from their perspective, the only destination where the Buddhists would be going after death is hell. So again, the concept of soul is no doubt acceptance of a self which is unitary, eternal, and independent. So this resonates the idea of a self according to the believers of Atma. And in the Islamic religion, there's a concept of Allah, the God. And then again, the person dies, and the person would have a union or communion with God or Allah. So, from the different religious beliefs, it is only Buddhism who rejects the idea of such a self, which is eternal, unitary, and independent. It is only Buddhism who accepts that there is no such a distinct self, something which is distinct from the body and the mind, rather the self to be merely designated or imputed on the basis of the body and the mind. And then within Buddhism, within the Buddhist the followers, there is one group who doesn't really accept the concept of selflessness as such. Rather, they would say the ineffable or indescribable self. Whereas the rest of the Buddhist followers, they accept the four primary teachings of the Buddha, that all composite things are impermanent, that all contaminated things are of suffering nature, everything is of empty and selfless nature, and transcending sorrow is happiness and ultimate peace and virtue. So here there's the concept of the selflessness. But it doesn't mean that the self does not exist altogether. The self does exist. The self that appears to our mind does exist. Because that the self exists, the self desires happiness, not wanting suffering. And because there's the self, there's the possibility of achieving freedom from suffering by eliminating the causes of suffering. But when we speak about this, the concept of selflessness, it simply means that the self does not exist as eternal, unitary, and independent nature. As said earlier, the self, to a natural, spontaneous mind, the self or the I is perceived as though like a master possessing the body and the mind. So say I put effort in promoting the positive qualities such as love and compassion. So from that perspective, it sounds as though like the self is the possessor, is the master of my body and the mind. And in some other occasions, we find as though like the mind is the one which is governing the self. So for example, when there's injury to your knee, then you would use your two hands to take care of this knee injury. So there is a natural thinking that the self is something so independent of the body and the mind. The self is like a master, independently a master governing over the body and the mind. So the Buddhism says that such self does not exist. The self does exist, but it does not exist in that fashion. So this is a mistaken perception of a mind. Although the self appears to a mind to exist as independently, but it does not exist that way. And then on top of that, rejecting the concept of a self to be existing as eternal, unitary, independent nature is that to a natural mind, to an innate mind, the self does not exist as unitary, eternal, independent. As such, grasping at the self to exist as unitary, eternal, independent is something philosophically, intellectually acquired, and it's not something innate. And whereas to an innate mind, the self exists as independent nature from the body and mind. So when rejecting the concept of the concrete self, it is not emphasizing on rejecting the self to be eternal, unitary, independent, rather a self which is independent of the body and the mind. So this is what is meant by the concept of selflessness, the selflessness of a person which exists as independent identity, independent from the body and the mind. This is what is meant by selflessness in the Buddhist concept. Then, on the basis of postulating the idea of the selflessness, they evolve four Buddhist schools: Vibhashika, Sutrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamika. The four schools, they differ in terms of the accepting, the selflessness. Other than the middle way school of Buddhism, which says that nothing exists objectively, everything existing by mere nominal designation. All other schools, they believe in some degree of objectivity, or in short, all other Buddhist schools other than the highest school, they accept in the self to be existing from its own side objectively. So now let's explore as to how the self exists from Buddhist perspective. Let's see. So we have the body and the mind. No doubt, our body is not the self. Now, if we want to posit the self as one of the components of the self, so since the body is already rejected to be the self, it's only the mind. Now the mind, again, it has varying kinds. One which is a sensual, a sensory mind. The sensory mind, the five sensory minds, the eye consciousness, nose consciousness, ear, tongue, and bodily. So these five, they come into existence only when you are in a waking state. So whereas during a sleep state, the self does exist, but these five sense consciousnesses or minds, they don't exist, which indicates that the sensory consciousnesses are not the self. Now you may point to the mental consciousness, whether when you're looking at me, you're using your eyes. Your eyes see my shape and the color. And then while you see me through your eyes, your ears hear the sound of my voice, the sound of my voice. So while you look at me, while you listen to what I'm saying, you're also mentally working, saying, "Oh, the Dalai Lama is using such hand gesture. The Dalai Lama is saying such and such thing." So this is something happening on the mental level. So here, your eyes are seeing something, your ears are hearing something, and your mind, conceptual mind, is trying to sort out as to what the Dalai Lama is doing. When you close your eyes cease to function, but the mental consciousness continues to work. So from that, we can easily distinguish between the sensory consciousnesses and the mental consciousnesses or the conceptual consciousnesses. So the mental consciousness during the waking state, it is grosser as compared to the mental consciousness during the sleep state. And within the sleep state, during the deep sleep state, the mental consciousness is much subtler as compared to the mental consciousness of the dream state while one is dreaming. And then again, the mental consciousness while one is unconscious, while one feigns, that is much subtler as compared to the mind of the mind of the deep sleep. And still subtler would be the mind at the time of the death, when one is in the process of dying. There, in the tantric context, there's a very subtle state of mind, known as the clear-light mind, which becomes manifest at the time of death. So we see that every time the self does exist, but these different mental states, they sometimes exist, but on the other times they don't exist. So from that we see that the mental consciousness again is not the self. So therefore the self, although it exists, but if you try to examine, if you try to locate to the self among the aggregates, among the components of the self, we see that the self is not pointable. The body is not the self, the mind is not the self. And other than these two, we don't find the self. So from that perspective, it is said that the self does exist, but exists through mere designation, through mere imputation on the basis of this body and the mind. Other than the mere appearance, the self does not exist as something pointable and something concrete objectively. So this is the presentation of the self according to the highest Buddhist school of thought. So now again back to the question, what is the self? All Buddhist schools, they unanimously agree that the self does not exist independently of the body and the mind. Now the second question is whether or not the self is findable among the mental consciousness. So then the highest Buddhist school says that a self is not pointable even among the mental consciousness. So depending on how the selflessness is posited, the four different schools evolved or diverge. So from the point of view of the highest Buddhist school, when this question is asked as to what the self is, what does it mean by the self? It is it is an entity which is designated on the basis of the body and the mind. Other than that, the self doesn't exist. This is the selflessness. And now the second question, whether or not this self has a beginning. So usually we tend to have innate feeling tells us that, oh, there should be a beginning to the self. Just as the physical things that we see around, they all have beginnings. So then when exploring the positions of the different schools, different philosophical schools, there is one set of ancient Indian school known as Samkhya school. Samkhya school says that, oh, the self and everything simply come into being randomly without specific reasons, for no specific reasons. Randomly coming into existence, rejecting the need for appropriate causes which are accountable for the arising of the self and all other things. And then one ancient Indian school of thought, not only that they disbelieve in the existence of the former and the later lives, they put philosophical reasons to say that there is no former and the later lives, on the basis of which they to this question whether there is a beginning to the self, they respond by saying there is a beginning because the self exists because the self arose randomly. And then there is another set of religious believers, of the philosophers, who said that, oh no, things cannot arise randomly. They should necessarily come about from their respective causes. And then when they are asked, as to what is the cause of this self, then they would say that there is no cause to the self, it came randomly. And yet there is another set of philosophers, ancient Indian philosophers, who said that no, there should be a cause. This self, referred to as mind, or the awareness, this awareness all other things other than this self is something produced from their respective causes, which can be finally traceable to what is known as the primal substance, or prakriti. And then the question is the self. So this self existed since beginningless time, which is unitary, eternal, and independent. So then, according to this school, when everything is dissolved back into the original source, which is the primal substance. So, from their perspective, when everything dissolves back into the original source known as prakriti, then the self becomes so independent of all problems, and because of which the self is designated to have achieved nirvana or liberation. Another question is, if this is what they believe, then the beginninglessness of the self to be beginninglessly existing, and the self to be endlessly existing, is what is commonly shared with Buddhism as well. The only thing is that the self, from Buddhist perspective, it is impermanent, and from their perspective, it is permanent. Many of the ancient Indian religious schools, they believe in the existence of God or Creator. And then the religious beliefs that evolved in the West, Judaism, Christianity, they believe in the concept of Creator or God. So that from their perspective, other things should necessarily have a beginning, because they must have a cause, and that should be traceable back to the original, the origin, which is God or the Creator. So so from their perspective, again, everything that you see around is so systematic, we should necessarily be accountable only if one believes in some external force or power, which can only be God. So as such, among the different religious beliefs, we can divide that into two. One who believes in God, and the other not. So those believers of the God are theistic, theistics, and those non-believers are non-theistics. So again, within the category of the believers or theistic religion, They say, oh, the God created the self and things, and this self is just once, and then will be finally destined either in the hell or the hell or heaven. That belongs to Judaism or Christianity. And whereas another set of theistic believers, they say that not only that these self or these things are produced or caused by God, but then they will carry on, perpetuate in the form of the later lives. The Christianity, for example, the Christians, they believe that even this very life is created by God. Oh yes, once we had a conference on the religious concept of Judaism. And someone told me that in Judaism, the God did create all these things, and the human beings also put effort, and it is through the joint effort of God and the human beings that things can be brought into progress, development, and so forth. The immediate production of these things is brought to by God, and then the immediate and someone who is to bring about changes in what is being created by God is the human beings. So I don't know from their perspective whether form and the later lives are accepted. Once I met a Christian believer, and then I asked him, because we are so friendly, and asked him, oh, why don't you believe? What made you believe that there is no former lives? And he said, oh no, just this very life is created by God. So how can it has a former life? So I really found it quite interesting and profound, because if you have this belief that this immediate life, this very life is created by God, then you will have a sense of intimacy and closeness with God. The more you feel close towards your mother, the more you feel, the more you feel like, the more you feel like obedient to your mother. Unless and until you are such a naughty child, you will become so obedient to your mother. The more you love her. So similarly, when you have the concept that this very life is created by God, then you will feel so close towards God, and because of which you become so obedient to God in fulfilling the wishes of God. And what is the wishes of God? It is to be compassionate towards other sentient beings. So you feel like embracing, you feel like extending compassion towards all other beings in order to fulfill the sentient beings, in order to comply, to make to make God happy. So this is something. It has its own unique benefit. So this is from the point of view of the theistic religious followers. So here, although the Western religions, Christianity, Judaism, they share in common with the Indian theistic religions in believing in the presence of God, but the way and the manner in which they believe in creating the creatures differ. And then from Buddhist perspective, since that the self exists only by means of dependence on the aggregates, in order to see whether or not there's a beginning to this self, we need to see whether or not the body and the mind, on the basis of which the self is designated, has beginning. Because the self is nothing other than what is designated on the basis of the body and the mind. Now let's see whether or not the body and the mind has beginning. Our body is derived from the substance of our parents, and the substance of our parents in turn are derived from your grandparents and from great grandparents, like that, and then we trace back to the original, the human beings who evolved on the earth, who in turn can be who in turn can be traceable to those animals walking on the four limbs, and then that can further be traceable to the legless animals, which can further be traceable to very tiny insects. So this is according to Darwin's theory. So from the Buddhist perspective, there is a legend which says that human beings evolved from the divine, evolved from the divine beings, according to the account of which says that the original human beings, they will survive through meditative concentration, and then gradually on subtler physical material things, and gradually depending on the grosser physical material things for sustenance. So now, overall speaking, the evolution of human beings, according to Buddhism and Darwin, broadly speaking, these two are same. And then, according to the evolution of universe in Buddhism, there's the concept of the era of vacuity. The earlier universe um, getting destroyed, and then remaining empty for a while, and then again the era of construction, era of evolution, abiding, and then again decaying. So the presentations of some of the things in the Buddhist literature, such as Abhidhamma Kosh, is totally unacceptable, because even from the Buddhist concept of Buddhist logic, just as Lama Tsongkhapa said, that if you reject logic, if you reject proper reasoning, then your position is not valid. So, because in Buddhist logic, there is the reason, a system of reasoning where you try to reject the position of something else by proving the existence of the opposite of what is rejected, and also you reject something by the premise that if that object to be rejected exists, it should be perceivable. But since that it is not perceivable, it is non-existent. So by these reasonings that is commonly found taught in Buddhist logic, we can see that some of the concepts taught in Buddhist literature cannot be accepted. So these two systems of premises is is the basic Buddhist the logical assertions. So this is what I usually share with other people. You try to be Buddhist, and you try to reject non-Buddhists by using all these logics. And then when it comes to one's own Buddhist concepts, even if they contradict with the logics that you use to reject other the reject non-Buddhist things, it is totally biased. The different Buddhist schools, they are set apart on the basis of on the basis of how they posit their philosophy, and even the teachings of some of the teachings of the Buddha, you interpret that as interpretable and not as definitive. If that is the case, surely then among the Buddhist literature, some there could be some which are acceptable and some which are not, because even in terms of in terms of explaining the cosmology, the cosmology, there are divergent views within Buddhism itself. The ones posited, ones found in Kalachakra treatise, ones found in the Abhidhamma treatise, ones found in Abhidhamma treatise. And another complication is there's a mention of the past Buddhas. So there are some cases, or there are some topics in Buddhist literature which we really need to think well, reflect well, whether to accept them literally or to keep them aside. Uh, in fact, there is there's a mention of how the universe is evolved, saying that first there is the wind element, and then because of this swirling of the wind, there is the fire element coming about, and from which arose water element, from which earth element. And then in another writing there is mention, there is something which is totally unacceptable. So some part of the Buddhist treatises cannot be accepted literally, and others can be accepted. So again, going back to the main point, our body is derived from the substance of our parents, which in turn are derived from the grandparents and so forth, and then finally traceable to the tiny insects who are the beginning, which is the beginning of life. In Kalachakra Tantra, there's the mention of space particle. According to contemporary science, there's a mention of the Big Bang. There's mention of Big Bang theory, accountable for the the evolution of the universe. there's a big explosion that happened, but this is not something standardized as yet. But the question is, even if that is true, the question is, had it been the case that there was only one Big Bang or earlier? But if you say only one Big Bang, this is contradictory. This is something unacceptable, untenable, because because this Big Bang is said to have occurred because of enormous energy, enormous energy compact, remaining compact. So this means there must be an object before this Big Bang, which was having that enormous energy. So in Buddhist presentation, there's a mention of the dissolution of the elements, and finally coming into very condensed version of the elements, and again from there starting again, evolving to grosser and grosser and grosser, the four elements: the earth element, water element, air element, the earth element, water element, fire element, air element, space element, and then again from this space element, again going back to grosser and grosser. So finally, these could be produced by the particles, and the particles, when gathered with the other conditions, they can multiply. For example, our body originally that is produced from a very tiny combination of the substance from the two parents, and then gradually they are multiplied, and because of which they assume different colors, different shapes. Then in terms of the physical objects, they should necessarily have their respective substantial cause. In terms of the subtle constituents of a body, the beginning is something which cannot be posited. It will go on. It can be traceable. It can be traceable beginninglessly. And then in terms of our body, that is originally traceable back to, in terms of the substantial cause, that is traceable back to inanimate object, which is totally disconnected with mind or sentient. For example, the substance of the parents, these two are inanimate objects, and then when these two are combined with a mind, then it becomes sentient. So now the question is, how can you determine whether something is inanimate or something is animate or sentient? So that is determined by whether something has a sentient, or whether something has a mind in it. If something is possessed by a mind, then it becomes animate, whereas if that is devoid of a mind, then it becomes inanimate. So, see, the human beings and animals, if you compare the two, of course we share the basic desire for happiness and not wanting suffering. But in terms of the sophistication in the mental thinking, there's a difference between human beings and animals. Even among the animals, we see that there's a variation in the sophistication of thinking. So this is a half joke. I asked this question to neuroscientist, in terms of the brain responsible for perceiving the objects, physical objects, human beings and the animals is much more the same. But human beings, in the case of the human beings, that part of the brain which is responsible for analyzing. In the case of the human beings, it is much bigger as compared to the animals. And whereas in the case of animals, in some cases, the animals they sense of perceiving the distant objects and the hearing power to hear very subtle sounds. Some animals they're very advanced, they're very powerful uh, senses because it is by means of these powerful senses that these animals they protect themselves. For example, when they encounter with an enemy from distance, they can hear the sound so distinctly, even from far away distance. And then, in some cases, they can smell very fine smells. So this is what I ask question to the scientists. The cats and dogs, they have the capacity to appreciate your kindness, but the mosquitoes they don't have that capacity to appreciate your kindness. The dogs they would start licking on you to appreciate you for your kindness, and the cats they will simply waver their tails, which is so beautiful to appreciate your kindness, and also the birds they appreciate that. But then I'm just wondering, I'm asking you, the students, if the mosquitoes, they have the capacity to appreciate your kindness. So when there are mosquitoes, when there's no danger of malaria problem, then when the mosquitoes they come to suck my blood, I would give them blood. I would let them suck my blood, and then they would complete this sucking the blood, and then in the end they would simply leave us some kind of bubble. In the end they would fly away, not at all expressing any sense of gratitude towards my giving, my kindness towards giving them the blood. So it's not that they are ungrateful, but it's because that they they brain on the brain level, they don't have that capacity to express gratitude. And I heard that it is only the female mosquitoes which suck bloods and not the males. Because the females, not only that they have to survive themselves, but they also have to sustain and help survive the eggs. So for that they need the blood. So in the case of these very simple animals, insects such as the mosquitoes, the brain level and the thinking level is simply the on simply on the level to express, on the level to survive themselves. So which means that their brain is not sophisticated enough to express any strong in the emotions such as hatred, jealousy, affection, gratitude, and so forth. It was way many years many years ago. There was a great scientist by the name Francisco Varela. He's no more. So through my discussion with him, we decided whether or not something is sentient or non-sentient. We decided that uh, an object which can move from one place to another in search for one's own sustenance, for one's own survival, so that we decided as sentient, as animal or sentient. And whereas those who are lacking this quality, or those who are lacking this potential to migrate from one place to another for one's survival. These are described, these are concluded to be non-sentient. The plants, they do have, they do live because the sunflowers. Did you notice that they divert the course of the course of sorry, they divert the facial direction towards the direction of the sun. Some of the non-Buddhist schools, they say that, oh, the plants, they are sentient because in the night they would sleep with their leaves, folding. So that is actually, in true sense, the sunflower, the opening, the the opening the petals of the flower at the time of the sun shining, and in the night closing. That is all done through chemical reactions. Say there are some plants. There are some plants with their seeds having fur. So that is actually nothing but 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 for but for the sustenance of that, because it is by the help of the wind that if the seed is quite with fur or with hairs, then it can be blown away to a distant place by the wind, and because of which they can grow and multiply in some other place. So there's one flower, yellow flower, by the name of kumbang, with uh, with the seed hairy in nature. So actually, the very purpose, the very reason for them being hairy, is because that they can so that they can be carried by the wind to different places, so that they can grow in other places and they can multiply in other places. And again, some seeds, the birds would eat, and then the birds would fly to different places, and through the birds' droppings, the seeds, they would start growing in other places. So here again, we see that they're all because of the chemical components responsible for all these things, and not because of mind. For example, amoeba, the very tiny living thing, amoeba. So that is considered as the tiniest sentient being. So the mind, as said earlier, the mind, it is of two kinds: the sensory minds and the mental consciousnesses. The sensory minds, they are grosser as compared to the mental consciousnesses. And for the arisal of any mind, they should necessarily come about because of many factors. For example, the eye consciousness, that should necessarily come about through the combination of four conditions: external stimuli or the external object, and the sense organ, and the mental consciousness, and the appearance. If there is no mental consciousness available, then simply through the combination of the sense organ and the external object, the I consciousness cannot be given rise to. And whereas, and again similarly, if a mind is deviated, directed towards the ear sense or sound, again the I consciousness cannot be given rise to. So for any consciousness to arise in the aspect of the cognizing awareness or experience, it should necessarily be contributed by a preceding state of experience. So say the evolution of human being in a baby in the mother's womb. At first there is the union of the two components of the parents. So at that point, it is said that a human to become, and it's not considered as a human being, but something to become into a human being in the future. Still, even at that point, there's the consciousness, there's the mind. So if any time in the ancient period, if it so happened that an inanimate object becoming an animate object, even now it should be happening, but we don't find any inanimate object becoming animate object or becoming sentient being. So what is then responsible for this sentient being? So it is this mind. So this mind is one which demarcates a non-sentient to a sentient being. And this mind, if we examine whether or not it is a beginning, either you should accept the existence of God who creates this mind, or you have to accept the causeless production, random production. Both are untenable. As such, the only alternative left with us is to believe that this mind has no beginning. So since that this mind has no beginning, the self designated on the basis of this mind as well has no beginning. So this is the Buddhist presentation of whether or not there's a beginning to this self. So the self is not produced by it is not produced randomly or causelessly, nor that is produced from permanent cause, nor that is produced from discordant causes, because all these three cases are untenable. So therefore, just as there is no beginning to this mind, there is no beginning to this self as well, which is designated on the basis of this mind. Now the third question, whether or not the self has an end. Again, the Samkhya, ancient Indian Samkhya school, would say that just as the self arose randomly without any specific cause, the moment the mind loses its potential to express itself in the form of experience, the mind will as well disappear into nothingness, and as such the self as well will disappear. There's an end to the self. And in this relation, there are many questions arising. If the self just is produced randomly without any specific cause and disappears altogether once this life ends, then the question is, what is the purpose of this life? What is the meaning of life? when these questions are asked, then one cannot really account. So then the human beings really become something like an ordinary animal who is simply there for reproduction, the purpose of reproduction, and nothing greater meaning. To this third question, whether or not the self has an end, in Buddhism, in terms of the self, explaining from overall grosser explanation, a mind is almost all together with the distorted misperceptions or the distorted mental states. A person who achieves the state of freedom or state of freedom from suffering, having achieved the state of liberation, at that point, um, this person can be of two kinds. One who is still having in possession of the residue, the contamination residue, the residue of the contaminations from the previous states, and then at the time of death, there's a total disconnection, total eradication of the previous contaminations. And at that point, the kind of liberation is referred to as the non-residual liberation. And one school of thought of Buddhism says that at the time of death of that person who has already achieved liberation, there's a total cessation, annihilation of the self and the mind. And yet, there are other Buddhist schools who say that this mind, this cognitive, this quality of the mind of cognition, and clarity, as long as that exists, the self exists. So since that, the knowing and the clarity potential of the mind is something which cannot cease. As such, the mind will continue. However, the distorted version of the person, the misconceptions of the mind, which also form part of the mind, since that they have the very strong opposing forces, remedies, they can be eliminated. Because this misperceiving minds, since that they misrepresent the reality, there must be another mind, mental state, which represents the reality as it is. And that wisdom which realizes the reality is totally in opposition, is a counterforce to this misperception, misperceiving mind. For example, say there is an object which is pink, and I see that as yellow. So this means that this perceiving of yellow is misperception, because it misrepresents the reality. The reality is not yellow, it is pink. So as soon as the wrong eyesight faulty eyesight is removed, I'll start seeing that object as pink and not as yellow. So the when there is fault in my eyes, there is the perception of a yellow object there. But then later on, when my eyesight is corrected, I start seeing that as pink. So there is a total, these are totally contradictory to one another. The same eye perceiving the object as yellow, and the another eye perceiving the same object as pink. So these two perceptions are totally contradictory and opposing to one another. So because in reality that is not yellow, it is pink, you call someone with a proper eyesight and ask him whether that object is yellow or pink, and the person will agree to that as pink and not as yellow. And then the reason why we saw that as yellow is because of the temporary factors which creates about disillusionment, which creates about misperception. So whereas seeing that object as pink, you see that over and over, you look at it over and over again and still see it as pink. And you call someone else with proper eyesight, he or she will also see that as pink. So say this is how the science works. Say you discover something or you see something, and then you simply don't remain complacent at having seen that. Then you call a third person to see whether what you saw is what exactly he's seeing the same. To see whether or not a particular mind is misguided or valid, it is determined by whether or not that mind has a backing or support of a valid mind. If there's a valid cognition which supports a particular mind in terms of its perception, that perception is considered to be valid. So maybe I mentioned this to you last year. Once there is a scientist who's already 90 something. So in this sofa, there's something mucus. Maybe this is a snot from the person who brought this of this sofa here. Sorry, the scientist was in his 70s, not 90s. And he's a psychotherapist. And he gave me one of his books. In it, it says, the title of the book is, We are the prisoners in the prison of anger. He told me that through examining many of his patients, some of his patients, when they were so depressed, when they felt so hostile and angry towards a particular object, he said that object to which the patient feels angry towards that object seemed so ugly and so disagreeable. And then he said that the 90% of that the ugliness of the object viewed is mental projection. So that truly resonates what is said by Arya Nagarjuna in his Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, where it says that ceasing of karma and afflictions is liberation from pains. And the karma and afflictions are given rise to by mental fabrication or mental conception. This mental conception is given rise to by mental fabrication, and it is the emptiness which helps us remove this mental fabrication. So this mental fabrication is exactly explained the way the scientist explains exaggerating uh, qualities of beauty or the ugliness on the object. Whether or not something is good or bad is again very subjective. Say there's one person, one man, say someone, a mother of that man would perceive that man as so nice and so kind, and yet another person, say a partner of that man, will see that person differently as her husband, and a third, a small girl, the daughter of that man, will view that person as her father. So, which means that the same person can be seen differently, differently, depending on the perception of the different persons. So one person can see the same, another person can see the same person in the light of enemy, because to that person, some kind of friction has made to see the person as disagreeable or unfriendly. So when a person is seen to be attractive, it is perceived to be 100% attractive, but this is not the case, because surely that object should have all different shades of qualities, attractive, non-attractive, and so forth. So say a particular object has a slight degree of good qualities, and then you try to exaggerate that quality and exaggerate to the extent of 100% agreeable or attractive, and because of which a sense of a sense of attachment arises towards that object. And whereas in the second case, on the basis of that very small degree of unattractive qualities, then you start viewing that as 100% ugly, and because of which anger, hostility arises. And this scientist, he told me that when you're angry, the 90% of the ugliness that you see in the object of aversion is what your mind exaggerates. So this truly tallies with what is said in the Buddhist treatises. So since that the excessive attachment, afflictive attachment, it feels so close to the objects, so close to the clings to the object, by viewing that as 100% beautiful or agreeable or attractive. So in true sense, that amount of that amount of attractiveness is what your mind exaggerates. It doesn't really um, it doesn't really represent the reality. As such, they they should be a wisdom which truly represents reality, which truly understands reality. So that wisdom would be counterforce to this misperception, and because of which those misperceptions we can bring an end to this misperception. However, in terms of the mind as an entity having the quality of awareness and clarity, there is no contradiction, there is no contradictory force uh, to this quality of the mind. Since that there is no contradiction to this mind, which is having the attitude of awareness and clarity, there is no reason as why this mind should cease. So since that there is no counterforce to this mind, the mind will never come to an end. And whereas the misperceptions or the distorted states of the mind, since they have the counter forces, they through bringing the counter forces into action, we can bring an end to these distorted mental states. So now see, we should be able to make a fine distinction here. The distorted mind, so it has two elements, one as being a mind and the other as a distorted version. So from the point of view being a mind, it cannot be brought to an end because there is no counterforce to this. But whereas this distorted mind, from the point of view of being distorted, from the side of the distortion, it can be eliminated, it can be removed because a counterforce can be introduced. So because then from that point of view, after eliminating all the distorted mental states, and you achieve liberation from suffering, and even if you die at that point, although there is total disconnection, total the non-perpetuation of the non-perpetuation for contaminations, but the self or the mind will continue. And because the mind continues endlessly, the person or the self designated on the basis of this mind as well will go endlessly. So now the answer to the third question, whether or not there is an end to the self, from Buddhist perspective, we say there is no end because the mind on the basis of which the self is designated has no end. As such, the self to be designated on this mind as well should have no end. So this, I think, is quite important point to give answers to these three questions. Now, anything that I'd like to share you with is Buddhism and Jainism both accept the dependent origination of causality. Although there are other non-Buddhist traditions which believe in causality, but the mere concept of causality, where you give no credence to God. So this is what is shared only between Jainism and Buddhism. But then the question is, whether or not Jain accepts the profound concept of dependent origination. All the Jainism and Buddhism share in common the idea of originating by dependence on causes. But Jainism, they accept in the concept of a self, which is eternal, unitary, independent. And whereas Buddhism does not accept such a self. So it is because of this that the subtle dependent origination is not accepted or is not found explained in Jainism, and whereas it is found taught in Buddhism. So since that Jainism accepts the law of causality, they should be accepting the dependent origination of causality. But since that they accept such a self which is eternal, unitary, independent, um, the concept of dependent origination is not found there. It is only Buddhism accepting dependent origination because of it not only because of the fact that it not only accepts the law of causality but also accepts the absence of such a concrete eternal unitary independent self. So this is something unique of Buddhism. Unique, the uniqueness in terms of accepting dependent origination. So then Buddhism, when explaining from the point of view of the suffering which is not created by God or created by external force, rather it is created by one's own force, by one's own actions, negative actions. In this relation, the Buddha taught the first two truths out of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of the suffering and the truth of the cause of suffering. And then the next set of the causality, that is through genuine effort of eliminating the causes of suffering, one will achieve the state of liberation. And this liberation can be given rise to by proper effort of the path. So these two, the truth of the path and the truth of the cessation, the truth of the freedom from suffering, these two form the third and the fourth noble truths. So the foundation of Buddhism is the teaching on Four Noble Truths, which is based on the idea of dependent origination. Question answers. We have a review class afternoon. The question answers. So I'm thinking of finishing this. Siva. Yeah, too long. La. Und the question is in relation to the four existences, the existence of the waking state, the existence of birth, death, intermediate state, and the full-fledged existence. During the the existence of death, the state of the existence of death, from the sutric system, the system of sutra, it is said that it assumes neutral state. Whereas from tantric point of view, we can utilize that and transform that into virtuous state. At the time of at the time of the death or the dying, while one is in the process of dying, all grosser states of the mind cease. And then from the Abhidhammakosha point of view, that is explained from the grosser mental states. But from the tantra, but then and then from the sutric system, professional wisdom system, there's a mention of the mind to be neutral state, but still is gross. And then from this tantric point of view, at the time of the subtlest mental state, all grosser perceptions cease. Say when a person is in a state of unconscious state, there the mind is subtler, and even during the sleep, mind is also subtle. Say when a person is in the state of in the process of dying, where the heartbeat stops, the brain activation stops, there is the ceasing of the external breath. When the subtle state of mind is manifest, all grosser perceptions that we used to have all cease. Tenzin Gyatso, he explained this subtle state of the mind to be sharing a similar nature as that of direct perception of emptiness. Now the existence of the exist the existence of birth, again, from the point of view of the Abhidhammakosha and so forth, it is grosser. From the point of view of Tantra, it is the clear light. again during the subtle state of the birth, existence of birth, there is no the ordinary perceptions or the grosser perceptions that we used to have in a normal state. So perhaps the kind of perception that one will have to us right now and what is seen by the intermediate being could be different, because the medium through which we perceive the object right now is much grosser as compared to the medium through which the object is perceived by a intermediate being. So although we all passed through this intermediate state, but we couldn't really remember our experience during the intermediate state. So according to the treatises, the intermediate states, during the intermediate state, one experiences the perceptions. And then the state of full blossoming, this is the state between the state of existence of birth and the state of the death. So those people who are not used to the practice of so the question that you have given is something unique. The next question. Talking about the three councils of Buddhist teachings. So asking as to whether Amarvati is the place where the Mahayana, the minor teachings of Buddhism, they are compiled. And the second question is, what is the main purpose for the degeneration of Buddhism in India? The three councils of compiling the Buddhist teachings, and the three turnings of the wheel. These are three different things. and various the councils or compiling the discourse of Buddhism, Buddhist teachings that should be understood as differently from the three turnings of the wheel. The three turnings of the wheel, the first one is done in Varanasi, and the second one in the Water Peak, and the third one in Yangbachin. And the third turning of the wheel is known as distinguishing the teachings of the Buddha. Out of the three turnings of the wheel of the Buddhist teaching, the first one is primarily meant for those practitioners seeking personal liberation, and the second and the third meant for those practitioners of the minor tradition. The first one is primarily found in the Pali language, and whereas the second and third in the Sanskrit language. And in Cultivate Tantra, there's mention that the tantric teachings are given in Amarvati. When talking about the three principal deities of Manjushriya, Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, and Vajrapani, it is to do with Tantra. And there is a debate or argument whether or not the Mahayana teaching is authentic teaching of the Buddha. And Bhavaviveka, a great Indian master, in the blazing of reasoning, he said that Bhavaviveka, the Mahayana teachings, although it's not found commonly, but they are being compiled by the Manjushri, Maitreya, and so forth, the Bodhisattvas. And it is said that in Bodh Gaya, according to the writings, there's mentioned that that in the Bodh Gaya, there, while the Buddha while the Buddha was giving discourse, he was surrounded by thousands of arahats, superior beings. But actually, we go there. It's such a small place. But however, they can be accepted on the basis of a unique perception, a special perception in relation to people who have more refined state of karmic connection. Say, the Buddha, when he said the syllable just one syllable. So this is referred to as the Perfection Wisdom Sutra, single syllable Perfection Wisdom Sutra. But it is not the case that when the Buddha said the syllable everyone attending the discourse understood this to be meaning emptiness. So it is very clear that some of the teachings of the Buddha, particularly the Mahayana teachings, and still the tantric teachings, they are given to disciples who have very special matured karmic potential. And in tantra as well, you find different kinds of teachings taught for those who restrain from attachment and who are inclined towards the perfection, and who are inclined towards the attachment. Some of the tantras are taught by Buddha while the Buddha assumed a state of a bhikshu or a state of monk. And there's a particular tantric teaching of the Buddha with 3 commitments. So at the heart of that mandala is the practitioner visualizing oneself in the aspect of the Buddha in the form of a bhikshu. The teachings can be categorized under 3. 1, a teaching based on refraining from attachment, and the second teaching based on the vast scope of the grounds and the paths. In the first teaching, there is total discouragement of applying these 7 negative verbal and the physical actions, whereas in the case of the second set of the teachings meant for those practitioners inclined towards the vast scope, the grounds and paths. So there, one is allowed to practice these 7 verbal and physical non-virtuous actions, provided that is of great benefit to other sentient beings. So the first set of teaching is meant for those people who seek personal liberation, and whereas the second set of teaching is meant for the bodhisattvas and who are advised to refrain primarily the mental negativities. And whereas the third set of teaching is the teaching given by the Buddha, where the Buddha arose himself by discarding his appearance of the bhikshu and assuming a state of the a state of the divine kings. The Buddha himself appearing in the principal deity, in the form of the subordinates and the principal deity, all simultaneously, and then giving teachings. So since that, this third set of teaching involves utilizing sensual objects into the path. The Buddha himself, the teacher himself, arose in the aspect in accordance with those objects. And then the compilers constitute some of the bodhisattvas, such as Samadabhadra, Vaishapani, and so forth. So, and Chandrakirti, he very clearly stated that the teachings can be given by the Buddha in different ways, even in the context of the third, where the Buddha taught the teaching to the subjects who are of different mental continuum as the Buddha himself, and the other and the reason for the degeneration of Buddhism in India, so that is up to the historians. And I don't know that so well, but there's one professor by the name Joshi, a professor in Chandigarh University. So that was way back many years ago. So he pointed to three main reasons for the degeneration of Buddhism in India. So I really took them so seriously. One, by external force. Invasion by the Turks. And second one is the kings existing then were having the power, and who became more inclined towards the non-Buddhist and practitioners, and because of which there is less interest in Buddhism coming about. And the third reason is the donors becoming the decrease in the number of the donors towards the Buddhist practitioners. And the reason for that decrease is because of the lack of morality among the monastic members, Buddhist monastic members. And then another point given is the practice of Tantra so explicitly done. The practice to be done in association with consort, in association with alcohol, in association with mantras and so forth. So because that these tantric practices became so explicit, then people tend to get confused, and because of which the interest in Buddhism disappeared. So therefore, it is really very important for all of us to make sure that one practices one practices Dharma so genuinely, so wholeheartedly that the faith, the ordinary lay people have towards Buddhism is not lost. So there are tantric practitioners. There are people who claim themselves to be tantric practitioners, but in true sense, well, not at all qualified. And then, in terms of their mental qualities, it's just so ordinary, and the physical action-wise, again, disagreeable. This is what we need to discourage. Again, one thing is what I heard quite recently during the time of the war invasion from the Turks to India. The first the Muslim invasion. So there, the Muslim warriors, they pierced the Buddhist monks with the knife, sword, and so forth. But monks didn't respond to this in a negative way, in a harmful way, in a violent way. See, they simply resented, or they simply endured the harmful actions. And the historian, he mentioned a sense of amazement. So the question is, in Buddhism, the self is said to be imputed on the basis of the body and the mind. And the question is, while the body and the mind undergo changes, but the self does not change, so there seems to be contradiction. So what is that? And then His Holiness' response: this is not true. Just as the aggregates are impermanent, the body and mind are impermanent, the self as well is impermanent. So this is the whole reason as to why Buddhism believes that the self is impermanent. Because when we say, when your body is sick, then we say, I'm sick. So just as this is what we say, this truly is the truth. So it's all because that the self is designated on the basis of the body and the mind. Whereas if the self is considered to be independent of the body and the mind, then while the body and the mind undergoes change, the self should not be posited as changing. Do you understand? So Buddhism says the self is merely imputed on the basis of the body and the mind. So because that the self is designated on the basis of the body and the mind, because that the body and mind change, the self as well should be changing and impermanent. The question is, in Buddhism, the self is considered to be beginningless and endless. And whereas on the other hand, it says that the is self is under the sway, the self, the self undergoing pains and agony and samsara is because of its influence, its is being under the sway of karma and afflictions and karma they are created newly. So there is a beginning to these things to which the self depends. So how can you say that the self is beginningless? His Holiness's response. In Buddhism, there is what is known as four principles. So one, there is the principle of dependence. So this is what we can speak from the point of view of chemistry as well. Because of the combination of two different chemicals, there is the evolving of a new compound. So this new compound comes into being but depends on the two. He's also wondering if there is a cooler air conditioner here. So say the temperature inside this room is different from the temperature outside this room, and then when there is the collision of these two different states of the air, inside and outside, then the person standing at the door is experiencing something different from what we're experiencing here. This is what is known as the principle of functioning. And then the principle of dependence. The principle of dependence is that what is present is seen is the result of what is present existent, what was existent last time, yesterday, and what was there yesterday was the result of what was there 2 days ago. So there we see a causation, the role of causation responsible for giving rise to something new. And then the third or the fourth the principle, the principle of the natural, the principle of nature. So if you ask as to why the fire burns and not water, so this is because of the nature of the fire. So, for example, this morning, as soon as you wake up, you start meditating on bodhicitta and meditating on compassion and so forth. And then during the daytime, even if you encounter with difficulties, then you can deal with that so easily. So if you reflect on these four principles in connection with the question whether or not the mind has a beginning, the mind being under the influence of afflictions since beginningless time, its it corresponds to the fourth principle, the principle of nature, that so when asked whether or not samsara has an end, the Buddhist texts say yes, but that is in relation to a specific instant of a person, whereas in terms of the overall, there is no end to samsara. So as we discussed earlier, the existence of birth is because of the existence of the death. Someone else, after dying, then one undergoes the birth. So although there's mention of the existence of death, but in terms of the clear-light mind, this clear-light mind is what is the object on the basis of which the samsara and enlightenment are explained. Enlightened state mind is also the clear-light mind, and the samsaric mind, in the ultimate sense, is also the clear light. So this innate so this clear mind is referred to as pure, even at the time of samsara, and as well as at the time of enlightenment. In the New Translation Tantric system, there's the mention of the evolutionary dissolution process, and the evolutionary dissolution process, and the reverse order. So in the Dzogchen, in the Dzogchen treatise, there's a mention of ignorance, various kinds of ignorance responsible for giving rise to all samsaric perceptions. So the easiest thing to say is that everything is by due to their own nature. So the reason why there is no beginning to the mind is because it's nature. So we should reflect on the four principles, which in turn is based on the fourth, the principle of nature. That the existed self is also by nature. It's not something randomly existed. And desiring, wishing for happiness and not wanting suffering is also by nature. And how to achieve that happiness and how to eliminate suffering is by means of the principle of dependence. And that, as to how to prove that, as to how to establish the means to achieve happiness in these things, is done by the principle of reasoning, proper reasoning. It is by using these four principles that the teaching of Four Noble Truths is established. Okay, we stop here for today.